He is an M&A veteran who struck deals across several Asian countries. He is currently steering the Indian operations of Singapore's state-owned sovereign wealth fund Temasek. In conversation with me today is Rohit Sipahimalani, the India head of Temasek and also the co-head of Temasek's co-investment group. Rohit, thank you so much for taking out time and speaking to ET Now. Rohit, let me start off by asking you about the new government that's in place at the center. How confident are you of the Modi regime getting the investment climate back on track, and do you think the Indian government will walk the talk? Because there were several bold promises that were made before the elections.
Look, I think for us, what is most important is really stability, a stable government with consistent policies and one that can execute. And I think clearly this is the first time in 30 years where you have a single party majority government. And that obviously gives us, that encourages us that we will see the ability to execute out there. So clearly from that perspective, we are positive.
All right. What about the near-term growth story of India? With the Modi government coming in, there's a lot of renewed optimism on the ground. There are mixed reviews. Some feel that the optimism has indeed translated into sufficient domestic activity picking up. Some say no. There are the naysayers. What is your point of view as far as the near-term growth story of India is concerned?
So structurally, we've always found India an attractive market. It resonates very well with our overall investment themes of transforming economies, growing middle-income populations, emerging champions, companies with comparative advantage in certain export sectors. India also has, its themes of consumption, urbanization, etc., all resonate strongly with our investment themes. So we've always been, found India an attractive place to sort of invest for those reasons. I think at this point in time, we've gone through a cyclical slowdown over the last few years. We do feel that we've, are coming off the bottom. And our outlook for the next few years is actually quite positive. You're not going to see overnight miracles, but I think we are a long-term investor and looking for the next 3 to 5 years, we feel pretty positive about the outlook.
All right, no overnight miracles. Let's also get in a quick word in from you on the budget. The budget from the Modi government was perhaps the most eagerly awaited policy statement from an Indian government in recent times. Were you satisfied with the roadmap that has been laid out by the Modi government?
So if you look at the budget, it was a 7-month budget, right, till the next budget. I mean, for us, the most important thing we were looking for in the budget was a commitment to fiscal consolidation, which I think the finance minister was very clear about. Beyond that, in the near term, I think the biggest obstacle to growth has been a lot of operational bottlenecks, clearances, etc., which have held up a lot of projects. And I think from our perspective, that's the most important thing we need to see happening on the ground to see a revival of growth. It also would, improve corporate confidence, which you're already seeing signs of. And ultimately, the slowdown in the economy was driven by a slowdown by private sector investment. So if we can get that going again, I think that's what's needed to see the positive outlook we hope for over the next few years.
In your opinion, what should perhaps be some of the top priorities of the Modi government to speed up domestic activity and also rake in big money from overseas investors like perhaps you?
So look, I have always, it's not our job to really advise sort of governments, but I think as we said, from our perspective, what's most important is to see a set of consistent policies, transparency around those, and just on a day-to-day basis, smooth removal of a lot of the bottlenecks that have held up a lot of projects. I mean, that ultimately is very operational, needs to be done on a day-to-day basis, but I think that's what we need to see the revival in the economy.
You spoke about consistency of policy as far as the new government is concerned. The budget, a lot of people feel, was perhaps the best opportunity for them to do away with the controversial retrospective amendments to tax laws. I know that doesn't directly affect Temasek, but it did affect international investor sentiment in a big way. Are you disappointed?
As I said, I think, the government has to balance a lot of priorities, and they've got clearly their priorities best known to them. But I think from our perspective, as I said, what we were really looking for in the budget was a commitment to fiscal consolidation, because that was very important. It links to fiscal deficit, it links to inflation, and so on and so forth. Those are the key issues facing us right now. That was the key point. Beyond that, at least, our expectations were not so much with the budget. Our expectations was to see a lot of the bottlenecks being removed on the ground. As I said, that's what's going to make the big difference rather than any major policy changes in the next few months.
Based on the feelers that you have seen and heard from the government, how confident are you of some of these teething bottlenecks being removed once and for all in the coming days?
So let me just step back and talk about, the sort of investments that we are looking at, and that'll, I guess, partly answer your question. In line with our investment themes, one key focus for us is consumption. And consumption means FMCG, it means e-commerce, retail, it means healthcare services in terms of hospitals, in terms of agribusinesses. These are businesses that are, they're a core part of our investment themes globally and are very important for us in India. And frankly, on an overall basis, in terms of the bottlenecks, etc., I talked about, they don't directly impact these sectors. What it does do is that obviously if the overall rate of growth in the economy picks up, these sectors are direct beneficiaries. Secondly, the other area we look at is emerging champions in areas like pharma and IT services, where India has unique competitive advantages. That's right. Again, those are not directly impacted that much by government policy directly. And then I would say the third area is the cyclicals, which is financial services, some industrials, etc. Again, we're looking at less of specific policies that will directly impact these sectors. But I think just like the consumption theme, you need an overall pickup in the growth rates of the economy will have a positive impact out here. And I think that's what we're looking at. So, so in a nutshell, it's not specifically clearance A, B, or a policy A or B which really matters for us. I think, as I said, if the steps are taken to step up the overall growth rate in the economy, that's what really, we think would benefit us in our investments.
Point taken, Rohit. Let me also take this opportunity to quote your chairman, Lim Boon Heng. He said recently, and I quote, "This year has been one of our most active years for new investments, the most active since the global financial crisis, driven by softer Asian markets of interest." So he's speaking a lot about Temasek being increasingly active in the Asian markets per se. How active do you think Temasek will be as far as India investments go, and could you also quantify perhaps some of the moolah that has been kept aside specifically for India investments?
So firstly, when we talk about weaker Asian markets, last year some of our markets like Singapore and China actually saw negative returns. The overall markets saw negative returns. So valuations were soft, and that gave us an opportunity to step up our investments because we believed in the long-term structural story of these markets. The same holds true for India. During the second half of last year, when markets were very volatile, there were a lot of blue-chip companies available at very attractive valuations in the public markets. We invest out of our balance sheet. We can invest in private companies. We can invest in public companies. And at that point in time, we saw these attractive valuations of blue chips in the public markets as a very interesting opportunity for us. Regardless of what scenario you took for the next 3 to 5 years for India, that was an excellent investment opportunity. And we took advantage of that. So whether it was in China, whether it was in India, what we found interesting last year was that we significantly used the market dislocations to step up our pace of investments. And I think that's what Mr. Lim was sort of referring to.
What's your take on the Indian capital markets as of now, and your opinion on the valuations? Do you think they're stretched?
So I think valuations are a function of really what you see the outlook. And as I said, the outlook we have today is actually quite positive. If you look at, clearly the markets are more expensive today than they were, 6 months or 9 months ago. If you look at multiples, the market trades at, 15.5 to 16 times forward earnings. A 10-year average is 14.6. So yes, it's slightly more expensive than the average, but it's not ridiculous from that perspective. So ultimately, I guess we as bottom-up investors, fundamental investors, actually I don't look so much at the overall index because ultimately there's a lot of variation amongst companies. So yes, there are some companies which are probably quite expensive. Some we still see as attractive in the context of the growth we expect from them. But obviously relative to last year, where we found the public markets very, very attractive, today our pipeline is more weighted towards private opportunities, relatively speaking.
I would also like to get your views on financial services. Financial services is quite a considerable chunk of Temasek's overall portfolio, 30%, correct me if I'm wrong. What's your view on the Indian financial services segment, and can we expect any sort of interest from Temasek in terms of investments in the Indian financial services segment?
We've actually been very active in the Indian financial services sector. So we have investments in banks, in NBFCs in India. Financial services for us is really a proxy for the economy. And so really when we talk about transforming economies as a key theme for us, financial services is the best proxy for us to play that theme. So today it is a large part of our portfolio in India, and I expect it to continue to be a core part of our portfolio in India.
So can you safely assume that perhaps there might be some new investments from Temasek in the financial services segment?
So specifically, whereas I said we look at financial services as an attractive theme, what we ultimately invest is a function of bottom-up opportunities. So like I said, last year we were very active and we invested a lot in quite a few financial services opportunities. We continue to look at such opportunities, but how much we actually invest will depend on specific opportunities, valuations, and so on and so forth. But to answer your question, yes, it's an area of focus for us and we hope to continue to invest out there.
All right. Let's shift focus now from financial services to e-commerce. E-commerce has suddenly become the flavor of the season. There are lots of e-commerce companies that are commanding mind-boggling valuations. Flipkart, to name a classic example. Internationally, Temasek has had interests in e-commerce companies, say for example Alibaba.com. You have interest in Snapdeal. What's your outlook of the Indian e-commerce space?
So look, e-commerce is a secular trend that we are seeing growth of that across the world. And I don't think India is going to be any different. We obviously at a very early stage in India of the e-commerce boom. So there's a very long runway to go. So ultimately, clearly we are positive on the overall market opportunity. Ultimately, who the winners are going to be is going to be a function of execution, scale, and so on and so forth. But clearly it's an attractive segment and one that we are monitoring closely. And as you said, we've invested in Snapdeal.
There are some critics who feel that perhaps the Indian e-commerce story is blown out of proportion. And how would you respond to those critics? Because they are the critics who are perhaps playing it safe and saying, listen, let's just wait and see how this story pans out. Let's look before we leap. How would you respond to that school of thought?
So look, I think whatever investments you make today, it's based on some outlook for the future, right? So I don't think anyone debates the growth of the top line in the e-commerce industry. I mean, we ourselves believe that the sector could grow, about 6 times in the next 4 years or so, right, in terms of total transaction volumes. The key issue is what is the path to profitability and how long will it take for companies to get there? And obviously different investors have different perspectives. You can take lessons from other markets, but each market is slightly different. And it's very difficult to make a call out there. The point I would make is that the runway is so long out here that I think whether you're early or you're a few years late, if you pick the winners, chances are you'll make a lot of money in the segment. So I think, people who are early and pick the winners will make more money than people who come in late and pick the winners. But if you pick the winners, this is a runway which is long enough and will last a number of years, and I think should be attractive for investors.
All right, Temasek clearly bullish about the Indian e-commerce segment. On that note, let's slip into a short break. Stay tuned to ET Now. Welcome back to ET Now. I'm in conversation with Rohit Sipahimalani, head of Temasek India. Rohit, in the last segment, we were talking about some of the segments about which Temasek is clearly bullish on. E-commerce, you spoke a lot about. What about the telecom segment? You are perched. You have a small minority stake in Bharti Airtel, which is one of the leading players. What's your outlook on the telecom sector? Because that's a sector that's been battered down because of a lot of regulatory uncertainties in recent times.
So telecom clearly plays into a key theme of ours of growing in middle-income populations. And I think whereas globally growth in telecom has slowed down, they're seen more as dividend-yielding investments. I think in India there still is significant growth to come. Not so much from voice, but from data, where we are at a very early stage right now. I do think that the worst is behind us for the telecom sector, and I therefore do think that the outlook for the next 2 years driven by data should be quite positive. You clearly need to see some consolidation in the sector, but overall we're quite optimistic.
If I were to ask you to cherry pick some of the sectors, Indian sectors, which Temasek India is most bullish about, could you perhaps name the top 3 of them?
So as I said, if I look at, it's tough to say the top 3 in terms of specific sectors, but again,
in terms of appeal at least.
But I have to talk about themes, right? So I talked about consumption. Now, The right opportunity for consumption may be in an FMCG opportunity or healthcare services in terms of hospitals or some agri-businesses. They're all driven around the consumption theme. And that, to me, over the last 30 years, you take any block of 5 years, regardless of what the growth in the economy has been, consumption has grown at double digits. So that's a very secular theme which we're very focused on. And some of the ways you play that is what I just talked about. The other area I do think the country does have fundamental advantages in areas like pharma and IT services. And I think those will continue to be areas of secular growth. And then thirdly, just because we see a cyclical rebound in the economy over the next few years, clearly some of the cyclical sectors, including financial services, I think will be key beneficiaries of that.
Let's talk about aviation. That's a bleeding sector from an Indian point of view. Temasek has a majority control over Singapore Airlines. There are a lot of Indian aviation companies that are desperately need for funds. They have gone on record and said that they would look at fundraising from strategic investors. How interested is Temasek as far as the Indian aviation sector is concerned?
So look, we always say that we are open to investments in all sectors. Probably the only sectors we won't invest is in gambling and tobacco, basically, right? But generally, otherwise, we're pretty open for business. But fundamentally, you have to look at every situation on a case-by-case basis, right? So if there is an opportunity, we'll look at it. We'll look at it in the context of how attractive it is vis-a-vis our own outlook and competitive environment. Ultimately, a lot depends on value also. So in that sense, we'll have to look at value versus the price we're being asked to pay and the choice of partner and so on and so forth.
All right, you're choosing your words very carefully, Rohit. All right, tell us more about the Temasek India theme for FY15. Are we likely to see more fresh investments, more divestments? There must be something that must have been planned for the rest of the year. Could you throw some light on that front?
So overall, I would say we are looking more at investments than divestments. And that's a function of our general outlook for the next few years. That was true even last year, where our focus was more on investments, and I think holds true this year too. I think we will look at selective divestments where we think the valuation suggests that it should be divested or investment theme is played out. But primarily, the focus is on new investments. As I mentioned earlier, whereas last year we were more public market focused, I see the pipeline being more private transaction focused this year. Ultimately, how much we invest will be a function of the right opportunities, the right valuations. I mean, ultimately, if we cannot agree on terms that are acceptable to both sides, we don't have asset allocation. We have our broad themes and we look at bottom-up investments. If the right opportunities are in India or in some other country, we will look at that. But what I can say is that we have 20 people on the ground in India and it's a focus market for us. So I hope to be pretty active here over the next year.
Could you give us a preliminary ballpark figure and quantify perhaps the investments that you have lined up for India? A preliminary ballpark figure subject to, of course, things changing on the ground.
So very difficult to say. And it's exactly for the reason I mentioned, right? I mean, we may have the best of intentions of doing a lot of deals, but if you don't get the right opportunities, for us, what is more important is to do the right deals. And we have the flexibility of basically investing across the globe. So ultimately, if we find the right opportunities here, which I hope we will be making the investments. But if we don't get to the right marriage or the right opportunities here, so it's very difficult, and we don't, therefore, by definition, we don't have specific asset allocation targets by market or by sector. We have our broad themes and we invest based on bottom-up opportunities.
All right, Rohit, I would also like to talk to you about corporate governance. In the past, you spoke about marriages as far as investments go. In the past, there are several marriages that have gone wrong between private equity players and some of the Indian companies. You're well aware of some of the recent examples. How important is it to have a significant level of trust between you as an investor and the Indian promoter? And what are some of the safeguards that can be perhaps put in place to ensure that the script doesn't go wrong later?
So I think the most important thing you mentioned was the level of trust up front. And so therefore, any investment we make, the most important thing is the comfort between the two partners. And so we take a lot of time to get to know our partners, for them to get to know us, to make sure we have a common philosophy towards business, towards governance, etc. And that forms the basis of our investment. The other thing is that our approach to governance is that we're not looking to run the companies. we basically back managements and boards. And really, then we leave it to the boards and the companies to run the companies. We are there to offer our network, other things that we can offer to the company in terms of adding value out there. But we will offer that up. We do not force companies to act just because we are an investor out there. That we rely on the governance through the board and management. So once you have alignment on that, you have alignment on business philosophy and governance, and you're comfortable with a partner, normally businesses can go up and down, but you shouldn't have a problem from a governance perspective. And I think that's been our approach, and I think we've touch wood, we're very comfortable with all our partners in India.
So do you think, if I were to put you in a scenario 5 years back, say compared to today, do you think today the need for more due diligence to ensure that there is no trust deficit as far as Indian promoters are concerned is much higher than ever before because of the recent cases?
It's something it doesn't sort of keep me awake at night, because we've always had an approach where we felt that we need to be very comfortable with our partners before we invest. So we've always had a rigorous approach towards building relationships before we make investments, to make sure we are aligned. That was true 5 years ago, that's true today. So from our perspective, I really don't think things have changed that much from that perspective.
All right. How friendly do you think the Indian regulatory environment is for a sovereign wealth fund like Temasek to make investments? Are you hoping for some tinkering in the regulatory atmosphere to perhaps make your investments, to perhaps facilitate your investments in a quicker and more effective manner, or are you happy with the status quo?
I don't think the regulatory framework has come in the way, typically, of our making investments. So not specifically on that, no issues.
So as of now, status quo will keep you happy?
Yeah, from an investment process perspective, yes. Yeah.
If there was a particular sector that you think is really going to drive the Indian economy, infra is a sector which everybody is betting on, but infra has not had quite a good run because of several policy uncertainties. If there was a sector that you think could really drive the Indian growth story in the near future, which sector would you bet on?
So infrastructure is critical for long-term growth, right? So, I don't think India can grow at 7% and 8% unless we have the investments in infrastructure. And at some level, a lot of the investments have been made. It's just that you need debottlenecking to take place to allow the investments on the ground to become productive. And that's what I talked about. I think the key issue now is not so much of policy and all, which is, I guess, will come as we go along. The key issue is on the ground clearances, debottlenecking things that are stuck, so that actually you can revive the growth in the economy. But that, I agree with you, is absolutely critical for us to get back to the higher levels of growth that we've seen earlier.
All right, Rohit, my last question as India's Temasek chief, what are some of your top 3 priorities to make sure that India becomes a bigger portfolio of the global Temasek pie?
Well, I come back to the fact that we look at finding attractive opportunities, right? If we find the right opportunities, I don't think capital is going to be a constraint to the amount we invest out here. And so really for us, the important thing is to have a team that is focused, that is engaging with companies and actively building relationships so that we can tap on opportunities as when they come. It's actually pretty simple, but really that's really the key thing for us. Ultimately, whether we invest, how much we invest will be a function of the opportunities. It's for us to really tap the opportunities that we see in what should be a recovering economy over the next few years.
All right, Rohit, thanks for giving us an eye-opener into Temasek's viewpoint and also Temaseks India plans in the near future. Thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to ET Now.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.